Okay, hi everyone, thanks very much for coming along. So, as mentioned, my name is Gabriel Currie. I work for PwC in the Cyber Incident Response team, and I'm here to give you a brief rundown of some structured analytical techniques for cybersecurity. So, structured analytical techniques are something that's relatively commonplace in the intelligence community as a whole, and it's something that's kind of coming to prominence in the cyber threat intelligence community as kind of it matures a little bit. And what I'm hoping to do is give you a little bit of some of my experience of applying some of these techniques in cyber threat intelligence and in incident response, and hopefully giving you the tools to walk away and do the same. So first of all, why do we actually want to use structured analytical techniques? What's the point? So the idea is that when we're doing any kind of analysis, there's always some level of bias in there. And we call these generally cognitive biases. So as it says on the slide, a cognitive bias is a mistake in reasoning or analysis, often as a result of an analyst's personal experiences or beliefs. So basically the point is that when I do some form of analysis, that's always going to be coloured by my own personal experiences and the way that I've approached the world in the past and the way the world has been to me. And so if another person was going to go away and do that analysis themselves, they might come up with an entirely separate conclusion because they've got different experiences and the world has treated them in a different way. And so there are some examples of some common perceptual and cognitive biases there. I won't run through them today, but you can read through them later. So what we want to do is try and fix the problem of cognitive bias. And I'm going to talk through kind of two broad ways that we can do that. So the first of those is using analytical frameworks. So we want to properly think through the exam question. So try and remove some of those cognitive biases when we're actually performing our analysis and coming to an assessment. And then second of all, once we've come to that assessment, what we want to do is be able to clearly communicate the answers that we've come up with, our assessments, in a way that means the same to me as it means to you. And so that's when we use something called estimative language. So diving straight into kind of the first area that we're going to look at, analytical frameworks. So these are relatively commonplace, and some of you might have come across these in your lives previously. So perhaps the most basic example is the SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So when I go through all of these examples, what I'm going to do is think about how we've related them in the past to cyber threat intelligence or thinking about threat actors. So for example, we've used SWOT analyses to try and prompt us to kind of critically evaluate a threat actor, to think about, what are they good at, what are they bad at, and for them, and the environment that's around them, what are the opportunities that they have, and what are the threats that are out there for them. And that's something that's relatively well established in business. The other one is called a Stemples analysis. You might have seen this come across in stuff like, you might have also seen this referred to as something like PESTLE, which is more widely used in business. Stemples just takes the same thing and just adds a couple of letters on. And effectively, that's a framework for considering how an environment might affect a threat actor or might affect something. So we might want to consider, based on what we know about a threat actor, how are the various elements of the environment going to affect them? Or if we don't know anything about a threat actor, how might the environment mean that they were going to behave? So it's just a way to kind of prompt us to think about the question and think about a threat actor in a reasoned way. The one that I'm going to focus on for the next couple of minutes is more deeply around actually kind of analyzing threat actor capability. And so it kind of becomes useful to think about this in just kind of an easy way, right? Guns and tanks and whatever in traditional military intelligence analysis. So on the slide, we've got a tank. It's a T-34 tank from the Soviet Union. And the point is that when we're analyzing this tank, the threat that tank poses to us, the threat actor, is more than just the weapons that are on that tank. There's a load of other things that we need to think about when we're trying to analyze the capability that tank has. So some of the other things that we might want to think about is, what's the current morale of the crew like? Because people need to run that tank. What's the organizational hierarchy of that vehicle and the crew? And where does it fit within the wider kind of army? Where does it get its orders from? How does it make decisions when it doesn't have orders? Where does it get fuel? How does it kind of maintain itself? Is it repaired well, et cetera, et cetera? There's all those different kind of questions which allow us to evaluate the threat that tank poses by thinking about more than just the gun that it might have on it. So we can take exactly the same principle and we can apply that to kind of cyber threat intelligence. So normally we might look at malware from a threat actor, and the nature of the threat that malware poses to us as an organization is more than just the threat of that malware itself. So this is in effect the weapon, right? So there are loads of other things that we might want to think about. So returning to the tank and returning to our analytical frameworks, one of the frameworks that we can borrow out there is called the tepid oil framework, or the defense lines of development. And effectively, this is a way that the Ministry of Defense uses to think about threats or to think about capability. And what it encourages you to do is, just like in STEMPLs, to go through a structured list of all the different things that we might want to consider. But the problem with that list is that when we're looking at a tank, that's kind of all makes sense, right? We're talking about armies and we're talking about war. But when we're talking about malware, perhaps doesn't quite make as much sense. So what we need to do is change it around a little bit. So I had a go at trying to still keep tepid oil, which is harder than you might think, and trying to kind of make it so that it actually fits to the cyber domain. So a lot of those are similar, but some of those might be slightly different. And you can think about how all of those different elements might be applied into the cyber domain and how they might kind of prompt you to think about all of the different aspects of a threat actor and the impact that that threat might have on you. So that's the end of our really quick run through like analytical frameworks. So next we're going to look at the second question, which is all around understanding and communicating uncertainty. So I've come up with some assessments around my threat actor. I've come up with some ideas about how I think they might operate and how I think they might work. And what I want to do now is tell everyone about my assessments that I've made. So the problem is that when I say something about my assessment, that might mean a very different thing to you than it means to me. So this is an example of a study that CIA did a couple of years ago, well, about 60 years ago. And effectively, what they did was took a load of terms, so almost certainly, highly likely, very good chance, et cetera, and they asked a load of people what percentage likelihood those terms referred to. So you can see that in the example of probable, some people thought that meant a 25% likelihood that that thing was correct. Whereas to others, that meant 90%. And so that's a really broad range of things. So when I've made an assessment and I'm trying to communicate that to someone, what that means is that if I say something's probable, and I mean that that is 90% likely, they might think that that means it's 25% likely. And that's obviously a real issue. And those kind of issues are kind of cropped up all throughout history. So look at 2003 and the dodgy dossier from Tony Blair that was used to kind of justify the invasion of Iraq. And that perhaps didn't have great intelligence analysis behind it, and perhaps that didn't understand and communicate the uncertainty that was behind those assessments very effectively. So the way that we can fix that is by actually being really clear about what we mean when we're expressing that level of uncertainty. So this is the framework that we use at PwC. We try and incorporate into all of our reporting where there's some degree of assessment. So what we do is we make clear for every single term that we use, what are the probability ranges that refers to. So highly unlikely means it's between 0 and 10%, unlikely between 10 and 25, and so on and so on. And so what that means is that when I say something, the reader also understands what I'm saying in the same way as I mean it. And then when we actually use that in reporting, what we do is two things. So you can see an example down at the bottom. So PwC UK and BA systems assess it as highly likely that, blah, blah, blah. So effectively, we're doing two things, like I said. First of all, we're being really clear about the fact that what we're saying is an assessment, so it's not fact. And then secondly, we're adding a term after our assessment to show how confident we actually are in that assessment. So we say we assess it's highly likely. So that means we think it's between 75 and a 90% chance. And then we go on to talk about stuff. So that's a really quick run through all of my things. I'm sure I've been way too quick for time. So we can return if you've got any questions. I've personally found all of those intelligence techniques really useful when we've been doing our reporting. We're trying to kind of bring these techniques more to the forefront in the rest of the reporting that the team is doing. We found them really useful for analysing threat actors, but also just for talking about, when we're looking at analysing intrusions, or when we're doing any kind of subjective analysis where we're not 100% talking about facts, trying to make sure that the analysis that we're doing is as rigorous as possible. So that's it from me. Does anyone have any questions?